And thanks to all of you who are here in person, braving the cold and snow. It's actually not that cold yet. But hopefully I'll keep you semi-entertained. So this talk today is based on a draft paper that compares and contrasts the siting laws and eminent domain authority for building interstate oil pipelines, interstate natural gas pipelines, and interstate electric transmission lines. And when I talk about siting and eminent domain, because I know there's not too many lawyers in the room, so the siting process is how a pipeline company or transmission company gets approval from a state or federal agency to actually build the pipeline or transmission line. And of course, eminent domain is the power to take private property for a public use. And we all know about governments being able to take property to build highways, to build post office, to build schools, other sorts of public works projects. But what you may not know is that public utilities can use eminent domain to build transmission lines, and in most states, pipeline companies can also use eminent domain to build pipelines. And so they don't need government involvement in the eminent domain action themselves. They can bring an action in court in their own name as the plaintiff and take private property, because most states define pipelines as a public use or transmission lines as a public use. So they have that power. But this the paper looks at the different regulatory regimes in various states for building this type of energy infrastructure. And they're very different from each other, which is somewhat surprising. So regulatory authority for siting interstate electric transmission lines is all at the state level. So approval is required in multiple states, imposing multiple standards. So if you have a transmission line that crosses 4 or 5 states, the utility company or the merchant transmission company needs approval in all of those states, and the standards are not all the same. The same is true for interstate oil pipelines. But interstate natural gas pipelines are cited at the federal level, and state law is preempted or displaced. If you're building an interstate natural gas pipeline, you go to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to get approval, and you have nationwide eminent domain authority and nationwide siting authority. So these are all very different from each other. And so the research considers why each regulatory structure develops so differently, and also whether these regulatory structures remain adequate today. And I think that's particularly important right now, because unless you've been sleeping for the last 5 years, you know that we are in the midst of an energy renaissance in the United States. So 5 years ago, natural gas prices were very high. We were worried about running out of domestic sources of natural gas, and we were looking to import liquefied natural gas by ship from countries like Venezuela, who are not always our friends. For decades, we've been worried about running out of oil and the level of our oil imports and our dependence on the Middle East. That's all changed. We have more natural gas than we know what to do with. Our ability to produce oil is higher than it's almost been in 100 years. And that's all because of hydraulic fracturing. We also have new sources of electricity, wind and solar, on a major scale like we have not before. The problem is that these new sources of energy are not always where we have previously built our energy transportation infrastructure. We don't have a lot of interstate transmission lines from North Dakota and South Dakota and Kansas and Montana to bring wind to population centers. We don't have oil pipelines in North Dakota, which is the center of the new oil boom. And we don't have a lot of natural gas pipelines in North Dakota either, which is causing oil producers to flare 30% of the natural gas that's coming out of oil wells, because natural gas prices are so low, it's not worth capturing it in the absence of existing pipelines. So estimates are that producers are actually flaring away $100 million worth of natural gas every month. Not every year, every month. So our new abundance of energy requires new infrastructure to transport it. So this paper looks at where the energy is, what the infrastructure is, barriers to new infrastructure where we need it, and how we might address those barriers. So I'll give you my thesis up front, and then I'll sort of back up and explain where I'm coming from. So the paper concludes that the siting and the eminent domain structure for interstate natural gas pipelines and for oil pipelines actually seems to be working pretty well, even though natural gas pipelines are sited on the federal level and interstate oil pipelines are sited on the state level. What's not working is the siting process for interstate electric transmission lines. For interstate transmission lines, I think we need more federal authority to take advantage of the abundant renewable energy resources that we have in the Midwest. Now, what this paper doesn't do is consider the environmental benefits and harms of oil versus natural gas versus wind, or the environmental harms of building new infrastructure, and there are many. So the paper assumes that we're going to continue to need oil and gas and renewable energy for quite a long time, and for the most part that it's better to have the option of obtaining those sources of energy domestically than importing them from the Middle East or South America. So the paper solely looks at whether we have sufficient regulatory infrastructure to transport these new sources of domestic energy, even if there are serious questions about which ones we should use and the environmental effects of their use. Okay, so now I'll back up and show a few slides. So let's look at where these new energy resources are. Some of you may have seen this slide before. In the sort of purple and red areas, it shows where we have oil and gas as a result of hydraulic fracturing. I'll talk a little bit about the process of hydraulic fracturing later. So you probably heard a lot about the Marcellus Shale here on the East Coast, the Bakken Shale area up in North Dakota. We, of course, here in Minnesota get a lot of press about that. There's significant resources in California as well, although for now the state of California has not allowed hydraulic fracturing. I think that will change soon. And significant development down here in Texas and Oklahoma. Now this is a map you may not have seen. It's very similar to the one that I just showed you, but it sets out where the oil is versus natural gas. So when they talk about the hydraulic fracturing in the Marcellus Shale, that's all natural gas. There's no oil coming out of Pennsylvania and New York and Ohio. Where you have oil is up here in the Bakken Shale, and you have gas that goes along with that, but you have oil and gas together. Oil down here in Texas, and also significant potential oil resources in California, which is why people are so excited about potentially doing hydraulic fracturing there. And the other thing to keep in mind that most of these resources are on private and state lands. They are not on federal public lands, which means the federal government exercises very little authority over the production of oil and gas in these areas. It certainly exercises authority when it's on public lands, but very little of these areas are actually on federal public lands. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with the process of hydraulic fracturing, here is a map that shows what you do. You drill a well about 2 miles down, and then you drill horizontally. That's one of the big technologies that really help this. And then you pump down in the well millions of gallons of water and sand and chemicals at very high pressure. And what that does is create fracturing, fissures in the rock. And then the sand, and this is all the silica sand that comes from Minnesota and Wisconsin that you've read a lot about in the paper. We have the perfect sand here apparently for these operations. So then the sand holds open these fissures, and then the oil and the gas flows to the well and goes up the well. And the fracturing process is really exactly the same for whether you are looking for oil or for gas. So it's the same hydraulic fracturing process. So what has hydraulic fracturing brought about in terms of production? This graph looks at oil. And large-scale hydraulic fracturing in this country started around 2009. So this chart starts in 1981. And so if you look at Texas, the green line, decreases, decreases, decreases in oil production. This is why everyone was getting so worried. And then whoop, up it goes. Very, very high levels of oil production now in Texas. Alaska, because of the geology there's no fracturing going on, so you see continuing declining production of oil there. North Dakota, we hear so much about. I mean, North Dakota was not an oil-producing state. They had sort of a little mini boom in the 50s, and that was about it. So they're sitting down here near zero, and you see now, as of 2012, they're the second highest oil-producing state in the country. Still significantly behind Texas, but now producing more oil than both California and Alaska. And natural gas, we really see the same thing. Significant increases starting in 2009, and particularly from states like Pennsylvania and Louisiana that were not gas producers at all, and now are pretty significant gas producers. All right, so what do we have to transport all of these energy resources? So this is a map showing crude oil, refined products, and CO2 pipelines. Carbon dioxide is needed for quite a bit of oil production. The infrastructure is where you would think it would be, right? Very concentrated down here in Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas, where we've always had a lot of oil production, oil refineries. The little black dots are the refineries, so of course, we have some here in Minnesota, but lots of infrastructure here, and then moving up the coast, moving to Chicago as well, bringing all that oil to refineries and to markets. What you don't see is a lot of existing pipelines in North Dakota, where we now have a lot of oil. We certainly have pipelines coming down from Canada, which has always been a big source of oil for us. But you really see the difference between the intensity of pipelines down in Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma versus up here in North Dakota. It's also important to keep in mind that oil is an international commodity, so it's traded on international markets. So these various colored lines show the price of a barrel of oil here on the right, comparing, the yellow is Europe, the orange is Oklahoma spot prices, we've got New York, and you see that prices go up and down pretty much together. So when price of oil goes up in Europe, price of oil goes up here, and vice versa. And you don't see a downward trend starting in 2009 because of fracturing. So the fact that we're doing a lot, that we're now producing so much more oil, is not having an impact on price. Price goes up and down, not based on what we're doing with hydraulic fracturing here, because we just can't have a big enough impact on the market right now. It's completely the opposite for natural gas. So natural gas is hard to transport internationally. You have to liquefy it, put it on ships. We're starting to do more of that, particularly now that we want to export it. But it's much more difficult to do. So you see, starting in 2009, this light yellow line, light orange line, blue, I do know my colors actually. This light blue line shows a significant drop in US natural gas prices starting in 2009. That's because we now have more natural gas in this country. And you look at prices in Japan, way up. Prices in Germany are high. Same with the UK. This is why people are so excited about exporting natural gas, because prices are very, very low for natural gas, which is doing a lot of good things in this country. So you have a lot of utilities now, being willing to agree to switch from coal to natural gas, even for baseload electricity, because it's cost competitive. You would never have anticipated that, even 6 or 7 years ago, that you could think about those two together. But you see how hydraulic fracturing has a significant impact on price in the US for natural gas in a way that it doesn't for oil. And then this is the pipeline infrastructure that we have for natural gas in this country. And you can't see the lines quite as well, but in many ways it looks like the map that I showed you for oil pipeline infrastructure. Lots of concentration of natural gas pipelines in Texas, in Louisiana, very little up here in North Dakota. So you have these pipelines, bringing natural gas up to the East Coast, although now they're thinking about flipping some of them because there's so much gas in the Marcellus shale and doing some interesting things there. These, the blue dots and the red dots are import and export terminals. More of those are getting permitted, again, because we have so much natural gas, we want to do things with that. I think 3 export terminals were just approved in the last year, which was a big deal. Okay. So remember I said there's very little in the way of natural gas pipelines up here in North Dakota. That has resulted in this. So folks at NASA were a little concerned about a year ago. They said, okay, yeah, there's lots of lights in Chicago. A lot of people live in Chicago. Yeah, Minneapolis should look like this. There's a lot of people in Minneapolis. What's going on here in western North Dakota? It looks like there's a huge new city that all of a sudden arose in western North Dakota. That's gas flaring. These are electric lights. This is all gas flaring. And that's because natural gas prices are cheap, so you can't make that much money on natural gas. And there's no pipelines to capture it, and so they flare it. And it's a big problem environmentally, and also you're just wasting a lot of energy resources. But that is a direct result of this picture. Because you know, they're producing oil in Texas as well. In Texas, they flare less than 1% of the gas coming out of the oil wells. And obviously in the Marcellus Shale, they're not flaring any of it, because that's what they're trying to capture and sell. But if you have the infrastructure, or you force the building of the infrastructure, then you can capture that gas. But we don't have that ability right now. Where? Yes, I mean, it's not that there's no natural gas pipelines in North Dakota, but there's not enough capacity for all of the gas that's coming out of the oil wells. So the question is, how do you build more of them? Okay. I want to talk now about the current regulatory structure that we have in place. I mentioned it briefly in the introduction, but I'll go into a little more detail. So for oil pipelines, as I mentioned, states have virtually exclusive jurisdiction over the siting of interstate and intrastate oil pipelines. So, and also whether those pipelines can exercise eminent domain authority to get them built if the pipelines are not able to enter into voluntary easement agreements with landowners. So the federal government does regulate pipeline safety, but it provides no process for determining whether an oil pipeline can be built and where it should be built. And some states have very minimal siting and eminent domain procedures. You check a box saying you are a common carrier and you can build an oil pipeline. And you can exercise eminent domain. That's how it works in Texas. No review process at all. Other states, like Minnesota, do require a certificate of need, environmental review. You go through the Public Utilities Commission to do that. And virtually every state allows oil pipelines to exercise eminent domain. It classifies by statute oil pipelines as a public use. It's not that tough to build oil pipelines. Put aside Keystone XL. That has its own political issues that we can talk about during the Q&A session if you'd like. But if you put aside the Keystone XL pipeline, which does need federal approval because it crosses an international border, put that aside, and even interstate oil pipelines can generally be planned and built within a couple of years, so that's not too bad. And part of the reason that it's important to think about these timelines is, so pipelines are not the only means of transporting oil. Oil can be transported by rail. It used to be in the old days transported by teamsters, teams of horses. That's where the Teamsters name came from, actually. They were teams of horses that transported oil in the Pennsylvania oil fields, which is where we first had oil in this country. And it can also be transported by ship, and is very commonly transported by ship. So we have always had and continue to have multiple means of transporting oil, and that reduces the barriers to moving oil, particularly state barriers to moving oil. The only time we had federal siting and eminent domain authority for oil pipelines was during World War II, because there were attacks on the oil tankers going up the Atlantic, going up to the East Coast by Germany. So all of a sudden, we no longer had shipping as a means to transport oil. Pipelines became much more important. Congress stepped in. They overrode state opposition to a few oil pipelines to transport oil from Texas and Oklahoma to the East Coast. Those pipelines got built, but the legislation was set up so that after the war, that federal eminent domain authority would expire, and all of the authority went back to the states. Whoop. Oh, I'm a little bit out of order here. Okay, so here is what it looks like state by state in terms of the requirements for siting and eminent domain authority for oil pipelines. So you see these red states, the yellow states are the ones where there's no state approval required before constructing an oil pipeline. And these are in some states that actually have a lot of oil. The red states require approval before constructing an oil pipeline, but not before exercising eminent domain. You can start eminent domain proceedings before. The blue states, which are less than half the states, require approval from the state before constructing oil pipelines and before exercising eminent domain authority. So that's where you have to jump through the most hoops. And Colorado is now the only state that doesn't allow eminent domain authority for oil pipelines, and that's as a result of a Colorado Supreme Court decision just last year that looked at the statute and said, well, the statute provides eminent domain authority for gas pipelines, for transmission lines, but it doesn't say anything about oil. So I think that was news to everybody in Colorado, and we'll see what Colorado does with regard to that. So that's oil. Natural gas. So as I said, natural gas pipelines have a completely different regulatory structure. To build an interstate natural gas pipeline, you apply to FERC for a certificate of public convenience and necessity. If it's granted, that certificate allows you to bypass any state siting laws for gas pipelines, and you have nationwide eminent domain authority. One-stop shopping. And Congress created this process in the 1930s, so it's been around for a long time. There was concerns about monopoly power in the gas industry, and there were calls for federal regulation of the production and distribution of gas. At that point in time, a significant portion of the country was becoming dependent on natural gas for heating and for industrial uses, and only a few companies controlled all of the sources and the distribution of gas. Before that, most cities were dependent on used manufactured gas, which they could produce right there from coal. Also, some states were blocking the construction of natural gas pipelines to the East Coast. They said Texas, states like Georgia said, why do we need a natural gas pipeline in our state? It's not coming to us. And thousands of workers on the East Coast were laid off one winter as a result of gas shortages. So Congress paid attention, stepped in, and then created the federal process that we have today. And in general, natural gas pipelines, like oil pipelines, are sited and built within about 2 to 3 years of initial application with FERC, assuming there's sufficient economic demand to build the pipeline. Okay, let's talk about electric transmission lines. So interstate electric transmission lines, like interstate oil pipelines, are all done on a state basis. FERC has no authority. But unlike oil, which can be transported through multiple means, electricity can only be transported through transmission lines. And this didn't used to be that much of a problem. Most of our electricity came from fossil fuel, coal, oil, natural gases. So what you do is you transport those energy sources by rail, by pipeline, by ship, by truck to population centers. You build a power plant there, and you have shorter lines that then provide businesses and homes the electricity that they need. This does not work for renewable energy like wind and solar. That type of energy, for now, can only be transported through transmission lines. Interstate transmission lines take many years, often over a decade, to site and build. There's a lot of controversy, lots of lawsuits, often brought by environmental groups over transmission lines. So it's a much more involved certificate of need and siting process in each individual state, so much more difficult than a pipeline. So let me go back and just look a little bit at the transmission system. So the country's divided up into these 3 grids: the Eastern interconnection, the Western interconnection, and Texas. Texas gets to be its own country when it comes to electricity. It doesn't import or export any electricity, and as a result, there's no regulation by FERC of any sales of electricity in Texas, and Texas really likes it that way. So this is one area where Texas does actually get to be its own sovereign. Here's the transmission grid, and you see that there are significant transmission lines where you would think there would be in population centers around here, East Coast, got lots of stuff in Texas here, little more sparse in this part of the country. This is a problem for renewable energy. This purple area is where all the wind is. But not that many people live there, right? And we don't have a lot of transmission there. So it's not that we can't generate enough wind to power the whole country. It's that we don't have the transmission in place to bring it to the people who need it. They don't need any more electricity here. Electricity prices are really cheap already. This is a map. This actually doesn't exist. This is what some power companies thought what we would really need if we wanted to build out our renewable energy in this country. So all these thick green lines are the power lines we would need to build, but we have not built at this point. Kind of looks like the interstate highway system a little bit, which we relied on the federal government to build, not the states. Now remember, going back to this oil pipeline map in terms of the siting authority, I said the blue states that had a pretty significant review process are the ones in the blue, and there's not too many of those. Very different when it comes to transmission lines. So the blue states are the ones where you need a certificate of need before both building a transmission line and before exercising eminent domain. There's only very few states that don't require any certificate of need for constructing a transmission line. You probably need local approvals. And then some red states where you need a certificate of need before you construct the line, but not necessarily before exercising eminent domain. And I'm not saying that it's bad to have a robust approval process. I actually think that we should, but it's part of the explanation as to why it's so much easier to build an oil pipeline than a transmission line. What just happened there? Okay, I guess that meant we were out of slides, which is fine. We can go back to them if people have questions. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit more about my thesis, and then I'll open it up to questions. So my question in this research is whether each of the regulatory structures I described for interstate oil pipelines, gas pipelines, and transmission lines still work in light of these significant new sources of oil and gas and electric power that we have in parts of the United States that were not necessarily energy centers in the past. We don't have the necessary infrastructure to utilize these new resources, so do we need to change our regulatory system at all? Would that help? So for natural gas, I think the system seems to work pretty well for siting and eminent domain purposes. Everyone knows they go to FERC, they get their certificate of public convenience and necessity. New gas pipelines are being built all the time in areas where there's a real demand for them. The only problem is that natural gas is so cheap right now, at least as compared to oil, that in places that are producing both oil and gas, like North Dakota, all of the focus is on the oil, and the producers are not building the gas pipelines to capture the gas. They're starting to, but they're doing it very slowly. Instead, they're flaring it. As I said, 30% of the gas that comes out of the oil and gas wells, because the energy sources are found together. So what we need there is more regulation, either at the state level or the federal level, to prohibit gas flaring. That would cause pipelines to be built. Or you could tax such emissions like they do in Europe. That would work as well. So either approach would result in gas pipelines being built to comply with the law. Because right now, even the fact that the drillers are flaring over $100 million in natural gas every month doesn't seem to be enough of a disincentive. They're just making so much money on the oil that that's not a lot of money to them. Now, there was a lawsuit recently by landowners for the flaring of gas, right? Because they get royalties on this. So they're saying that's our money you're flaring into the air. So that may end up having an impact. And there's starting to be some political pressure as well. But the economic pressure right now is not there. So that's gas. Oil pipelines. The state-by-state siting and eminent domain system for interstate oil pipelines seems to be working. And I didn't know if I would conclude that going into this research. There certainly are building a lot of oil pipelines in North Dakota, in Texas, everywhere else. Oil is valuable. It goes for $80 to $100 a barrel. No one is wasting it. No one is flaring it. Everybody has every incentive to bring that oil to market. It is worth it to build the pipelines. And the more important point is, as I said before, we have alternatives to pipelines when it comes to transporting oil. We have rail. The rail industry is booming right now because it is existing infrastructure that can transport new oil from North Dakota. Now, that has resulted in more rail disasters like the one up in Quebec and others that we have seen. But the rise in using rail to transport oil shows that oil will reach markets one way or another. The infrastructure is being built, and it's being built quickly because there's so much money to be made. We will never produce enough to depress prices significantly like has happened with gas. There might be a lot of questions as to whether pipelines are safer or rail is safer. Most of the experts think pipelines are safer. We certainly need better regulations to address spills, but the regulatory system does not seem to be a barrier in building these pipelines. Transmission lines, as I said, I think that is a different story. Most states have a fairly comprehensive regulatory process for determining the need for new transmission lines, the environmental impacts, the economics, and where they should be sited. These are long, contested case hearings on these topics. It takes a long time to get a transmission line approved, and you have to get it approved in multiple states. So the question is, should we move to a federal structure for interstate transmission lines, particularly for lines to bring renewable energy like wind to load centers that are going to be several states away. Because right now, lines like these can take a decade or more to plan or build, if they're built at all. We've got new sources of renewable energy in very sparsely populated parts of the country, and we absolutely need interstate transmission lines to do that. We didn't need such an extensive network if we're relying on coal or natural gas for our electricity. What is interesting when you look at the history of this is, so why did we create a federal system in the 30s and the 40s for natural gas? It's because we had these bottlenecks and the resources, the energy resource wasn't getting where it needed to go. The gas was there, but transporting it to customers was the barrier. If we want to rely on renewables, we are at that point in time with regard to renewable energy. The problem is that as a nation, we just don't notice it that much because we still rely on coal and nuclear and natural gas for electricity. If we were completely dependent on renewable energy, they would see it would be seen as a national need to build these transmission lines, and they would get built. But right now, because we still have these alternatives that we can transport other ways, we're not at that point. The question is whether we'll get there or not. Now, convincing Congress to federalize the transmission siting and eminent domain process and preempt state authority is a little unlikely at this point. I'm fully aware of that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. So Congress has taken action like this on a smaller scale, even fairly recently. So in the 2005 Energy Policy Act, Congress federalized the system for siting liquefied natural gas terminals. Now at that point, the reason that there was seen as a federal need for liquefied natural gas is we thought we were going to have to import natural gas from other countries because we were running out. That has changed, but that federal siting process is now being used to more quickly permit LNG export facilities as opposed to import facilities. There have been 3 permitted in the last year, and so that may help the cost differential in natural gas here versus in Europe and Japan and open up new markets for our energy sources, which is generally a good thing. So Congress has federalized other siting processes more recently. Whether it can do that to build transmission lines to transport renewable energy will really depend on how much of our priority Congress wants to make it. If we have major blackouts in this country at some point, that's when things get federalized. That's when the federal government steps in. So that may do something, not that I'm hoping for anything like that. But I think it's something to watch because in terms of building large-scale interstate transmission lines, it's very difficult to do on a state-by-state level. Well, I will stop talking at this point. I'd love to answer questions about any of these issues, about the Keystone XL pipeline, which I sort of mentioned in passing, but didn't go into in any detail.